Hi folks, this is Jay. We've been looking at Jesus and the eyewitness of the Gospels. The Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony by Richard Bauckham, 2006. We have been considering Papias, and I want to read some information about Papias and just think about Papias just for a second and why this is important. In the Anchor Bible Dictionary, Shoulder writes, page 140, according to Irenaeus, our earliest witness, Papias was a hearer of John, the companion of Polycarp, a man of primitive times who wrote a volume in 5 books, quoted by Eusebius, Histories Ecclesiastes, chapter 339.1. Eusebius already doubted the reality of a connection between Papias and the Apostle John on the grounds that Papias himself, in the preface to his book, distinguished the Apostle John from John the Presbyter, and seems to have had significant contact with only John the Presbyter and a certain Aristian. Eusebius' skepticism was no doubt prompted by his distaste, perhaps a recently acquired distaste, for Papias' Charianism, and his feeling that such a theology qualified Papias for the distinction of being a man of exceedingly small intelligence. Nevertheless, Eusebius' analysis of the preface is probably correct. His further point that Papias' Charianism put him to the same camp as the revelation of John is surely relevant. It is notable that Eusebius, in spite of his desire to discredit Papias, still places him as early as the reign of Trajan, AD 98 to 117, although later dates have been suggested by scholars. Shoulder writes about the comments of Papias. What the fragments have to tell us about Mark and Matthew is information that Papias himself traces to the presbytery. Eusebius separates the statement about Mark and Matthew, but they may have originally followed one another and certainly seem closely related. Perhaps the simplest reading of the statement on Mark is that Mark served as Peter's interpreter, possibly in the role of a methergammon or oral translator, and wrote down what he heard Peter say of the words and deeds of Jesus, and that his writings is defective in order, though not in accuracy or fullness of recollection, because Peter naturally referred to the Lord's logi in a random manner. Some have suspected that Papias did not have in mind the Gospel of Mark that we know, but their arguments are tenuous. On another point, Kurzinger's attempted to show that Papias was speaking not a translation from the native language of Peter, but a presentation of the reports of Peter, an interpretation which he applies to Papias' statement about Matthew, but this seems to push a rhetorical approach to Papias' terminology too far. On the other hand, an interpretation in rhetorical terms is somewhat more likely when it comes to the suggestion that Papias meant to say that Peter spoke in charia style rather than in needs charai dictated, but the point that is debated more than any other is that what Papias had in mind when he said that Mark did not write in order. It is perhaps most likely what Papias was measuring. Mark by Matthew is said by Papias to have made an ordered arrangement of the materials, or perhaps more generally by Papias' own conception of what ought to be included in such an account, and that he had in mind completeness of information as well as order, in the narrow sense of the term. In any event, Papias is defending Mark in spite of perceived deficiencies, and Papias attests the role that oral tradition continued to play in the first half of the 2nd century. Papias, here it is, preferred the living voice to what could be found in books. Nevertheless, Papias seems to have known the Gospels, and he provides the earliest tradition concerning the authorship of Gospel of Mark. The testimony of Papias concerning Matthew is more problematic. Eusebius says that Papias also made use of testimonies from the first letter of John, and likewise from that of Peter. What that all tells us is like I've just tried to introduce you to Papias there, because he's central to our understanding of what happened in the early 1st century concerning the writing of the Gospels. What is very, very clear there, and what Bauckham is trying to prove in his book, is that ancient historians believed in the living voice. They believed in going to eyewitnesses and talking to them themselves. And what we see in Papias is this same methodology. Now, it doesn't mean to say that what Papias collected was 100% correct, but what it does tell us is that as historians we can't be dismissive, and as skeptics and as Christians you can't be dismissive of this kind of material in the Gospels. You can't just say, well, it's all myth, because you've got to be willing to realize that these people, when they wrote these Gospels, they believed that it was eyewitness material. And that's the point that I get. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15:6. It says, after that he was seen of about 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain until the present, but some have fallen asleep. Again, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6 is rooting his defense of the gospel based on people have seen that this was something that the resurrection of Christ was actually seen. Bauckham on page 14 writes, the source of oral historian are reminiscences, hearsay, and eyewitness accounts about events and situations such as contemporary, that is, which occurred during the lifetime of the informants. This differs from oral tradition in that oral traditions are no longer contemporary. They are passed from mouth to mouth from the period beyond the lifetime of the informants. The two situations typically are very different with regard to the collection of sources as well as with regard to the analysis. Oral historians typically interview participants in recent or very recent events, often of a dramatic nature, when historical coincidences in the communities involved. Very important that when we talk about oral tradition and oral historians, there is a difference. So the form critics and the modern scholars often would talk about oral tradition, and it would be like Chinese whispers. Someone would pass on information, community pass on information to another community, and it would get changed in the sieve. But because we've shown, because Bauckham has shown from Pelagius and Papias that there was this importance of the living voice to look at as a historian, that was a different methodology. It was a methodology of wanting to record what people say in an interview. That's historiography, and that is different from oral tradition, which is just purely passing on story from story to story. So a subtle but very important distinction that the form critics and a lot of the skeptics miss when they attack the Christian faith is that oral historians were involved in the writing of the gospel literature, and oral historians are different from oral tradition. We'll read it again. The source of oral historians are reminiscences, hearsay, and eyewitness accounts about events and situations which are contemporary, that is, which occurred during the lifetime of the informants. This differs from oral tradition in that the oral traditions are no longer contemporary. They have passed from mouth to mouth. They pass from mouth to mouth for a period beyond the lifetime of the informants. The two situations typically are very different with regard to the collection of the source as well as with regard to the analysis. Oral historians typically interview participants in recent or very recent events, often of a dramatic nature, with historical consciousness in the communities involved. Okay.